Breaking news this Tuesday night, missiles strike Poland. What we know about the deadly hit and whether Russia is responsible.
We will get to the bottom of what is happening.
The danger it could trigger a wider war. The hot commodity of children's cold medicines, accusations of price gouging and amplifying calls for mask mandates. No answers and no action, assessing the federal government's promise to tackle homelessness. Plus, they call him the boss.
I followed his trail.
Up close and personal with Banff's biggest and baddest grizzly.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with a potential escalation of Russia's war in Ukraine. Poland's foreign ministry says a Russian-made missile landed in its territory and killed 2 people. It says they don't know who fired it, and there is no independent verification the missiles are Russian. Poland is a NATO member, though, and any deliberate attack on it could trigger a wider conflict. This video circulating on social media shows a crater and an overturned trailer. It is said to be near Poland's border with Ukraine, not far from Lviv. Russia denies it fired any missiles into Poland, though it did launch a fierce bombardment of missiles across Ukraine today. Poland's prime minister immediately called an emergency meeting of the country's National Security Committee and increased the readiness of its military. Poland's president urged calm tonight and has spoken to the American president. Joe Biden offered America's full support into the investigation. NATO allies, including Canada, are monitoring all this extremely closely. So is our Europe bureau chief, Crystal Gamansing. Crystal, what did the Polish government say tonight?
Donna, Polish officials have confirmed that 2 of its citizens were in fact killed in Poland in the village of Przewodów. That's about 10 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And tonight, officials are on that site trying to confirm if the explosion and the fatalities were the result of a Russian missile strike. But Polish officials are not waiting for that confirmation. They have already increased the readiness of the military from the very beginning of Russia's full invasion of Ukraine. There were concerns about the fighting in Ukraine spilling over into Poland, and that's why early on we saw NATO bolster defense forces along the eastern flank. Right across Eastern Europe, there is swift reaction coming in from officials in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, as well as the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, tweeting out that she is alarmed by the reports coming out of Poland. Russia's defense ministry, by the way, put out a statement. They are denying that a Russian missile was the result of this strike in Poland, calling media reports a deliberate provocation and attempt at escalating things. Of course, as you mentioned, Donna, we saw a fierce increase of strikes by missiles across Ukraine today. Ukrainian officials reporting about 100 missiles being targeted at the country.
All right, Crystal Gamansing in London tonight. Thanks. Ukraine is not a NATO member, and though the West is supporting Ukrainian forces, we're not engaged in direct combat with Russia. If there has been a deliberate attack on NATO soil, though, that could change, and Canada, a NATO member, would be part of it. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson is with me. Mercedes, it is a tense time. What are the next steps in terms of NATO's response?
It is, Donna, and what's expected next from all of the sources I've spoken to is that there may be Article 4 invoked. That's basically a meeting, and it's a meeting that happens whenever member states feel that their territorial integrity or security might be threatened. It's very different than Article 5. Article 5 is an attack on one, is an attack on all, and that's only been invoked once in NATO history, and that was by the United States after 9/11. But even Article 5 is not an automatic call to arms. For those who are feeling anxious about what's happening tonight, there's a lot of discussion that would have to happen and a lot of belief that this would have to have been deliberate and worth a military response before that would happen. One of the senior folks in the military who I was speaking to earlier tonight said to me, look, if we put this into Russia's hands and allow them to decide what the trigger was with something as simple as a single strike, we would be out of control. The reality is, at the end of the day, this will largely be decided by the United States of America. And of course, it will depend on whether or not this was a deliberate or an accidental strike. And that's something that really is still being determined at this point. So likely at this point, Donna, that it will be Article 4, not Article 5, which is basically a meeting that's been invoked 7 times before. In fact, it was also invoked when Russia initially invaded Ukraine by 7 NATO members who were concerned about their territorial integrity, including Poland. This would not be the first time that Russia has potentially accidentally struck a country that is not Ukraine. They hit Moldova back in October, but there was less discussion on that because Moldova is not a NATO country. The military sources I spoke to also told me the Russians have largely run out of precision munitions. They are using dumber and dumber bombs, and they don't have great discipline or leadership, which could account for a strike. So, of course, we're waiting to find out what happened, but all of those things come into consideration.
What is Canada's response at this stage?
Well, Donna, at this point, it's pretty muted. We heard from Melanie Joly, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. She's at the G20 very recently. Take a listen to what she had to say.
So obviously we're following up this situation very closely. We're in contact with Poland as well as with our partners. My heart is with the family and loved ones of the victims and also with the people of Poland.
Does Canada believe this triggers Article 5?
We're following up this situation very closely, and of course we'll be having important meetings today with allies.
So as you can see there, Donna, very, very careful. There's a lot of phone calls, I'm told, by senior officials going on behind the scenes to the United States, Poland, NATO, and even they're trying to find out from Russia what may have happened here. But right now, everyone is being very careful with their words. A reminder, there are 40 Canadian combat engineers currently in Poland, but there's, of course, no suggestion that they were involved anywhere near this strike. But for those wondering about Canadian forces there, that's who's in the region.
All right, Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa, thanks. Russia's war in Ukraine dominated the G20 summit in Indonesia today. The Russian President Vladimir Putin is not there. He sent his foreign minister instead. Canada is among those pushing for G20 leaders to call out Russia's aggression at these meetings. As Mackenzie Gray reports, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was brought up during a brief informal chat between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20.
He's the elephant in the room. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov arriving at the G20 in Bali. Welcomed by the Indonesian president, who has the unenviable task of trying to bring together a group of countries that have almost nothing in common.
If the war does not end, it will be difficult for the world to move forward.
One of those countries that could help stop the war, China, whose leader had a quick conversation with Justin Trudeau on the sidelines of the G20. It's not the full bilateral sit-down that the U.S., South Korea, and Australia had, but it was an opportunity for the Prime Minister to raise key Canadian concerns. A senior government source says Trudeau brought up Chinese interference in Canadian elections with President Xi Jinping. Global News was the first to report that China allegedly interfered in the 2019 federal election by funneling nearly $250,000 to 11 different candidates.
It was a good conversation, and it is important to indeed keep channels open.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly also met with her Chinese counterpart, but wouldn't say what their reaction was to the alleged interference.
We won't tolerate any form of foreign interference at large in Canada, period. So it's not a discussion, it's intolerable. So that's our position.
Canada also made its position clear on Russia, behind closed doors. A senior government official says that Lavrov repeated conspiracy theories to world leaders, claiming the U.S. were operating biolabs in Ukraine, and that the WHO blocked a Russian vaccine. The next speaker, Justin Trudeau, who told Lavrov his claims were, quote, absolute garbage. After the meeting, Lavrov got the final word, saying countries like Canada were the ones that provoked Russia into attacking Ukraine. Lavrov left the summit late Monday night, but not before having to listen to a 20-minute speech from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who addressed the G20. I'm convinced now is the time when the Russian destructive war must and can be stopped, Zelensky said. With Lavrov's departure from Bali, it opens up the potential that the remaining countries could be able to find a consensus tomorrow on a final communique that might be tougher on Russia. Donna?
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Bali, Indonesia. Thank you. Prime Minister Trudeau has pledged $750 million to further Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. It's the largest chunk of money put towards the plan so far, earmarked to finance infrastructure projects in Asia over 3 years. Now to news in this country. Canada's Public Health Agency confirms what parents and hospitals are already seeing. A flu epidemic is underway. Its weekly Flu Watch report shows Canada's positivity rate was nearly 12% in the week ending November 5th. That is nearly double the number of cases reported the week before. This flu season is surging faster and earlier than past years, and we have already crossed the 5% epidemic threshold. Hospitalizations are on the rise, especially children, and compounding the problem is a shortage of pain and fever medication. Neethu Garcha reports.
There's been more of this and less of this. And while the federal government has assured one shipment of children's pain medication from the U.S. has arrived in Canada, it won't say how much.
Quantities have been established, but because of confidential business information, I'm not able to share them.
It's confidential how many doses Canadians can expect to receive of a medicine for their children that there's a shortage of?
It's the information of those companies that are importing.
Federal officials say more details about its newly secured sources of cold and flu remedies from abroad will be made public soon, and another shipment of product from Australia is expected later this month. Health Canada confirms it's aware of price gouging of products like children's Advil and Tylenol listed for nearly $300 on Amazon and has raised the issue with the retailer. The product listings now seem to have been removed. Another worry for parents, an overrun healthcare system is leaving long waits for sick children, requiring hospital visits across the country.
To wait long hours, it was quite difficult with the kid.
In BC, this retired ER physician is with a group calling for an immediate universal mask mandate.
To not act is basically facing the system to be overwhelmed, and so that when you or your loved one need health care, there's going to be nobody in the emergency department to see you in a timely fashion.
But BC's health minister says the message hasn't changed. Masks continue to be recommended indoors, but don't expect a mandate.
This is a big country. We're seeing a lot higher respiratory illness amongst children right now in Ontario than we're seeing in British Columbia.
In Alberta, the message isn't quite as clear. The premier there refusing to answer whether she'd recommend the use of masks.
Look, I've said that anybody who wants to wear a mask can feel comfortable wearing a mask. I'm not going to be mandating them.
Meanwhile, one of Alberta's biggest school districts in Edmonton is asking the province for clarity on what it would take to issue a mask mandate amid a wave of viral illnesses that's sending thousands of sick students home to their parents who are often unable to provide them any medication. Neethu Garcha, Global News, New Westminster, BC.
Prime Minister Trudeau's national security advisor believed last February's so-called Freedom Convoy protests posed a serious threat. That assessment came in an email tabled as evidence at the inquiry into whether the use of the Emergencies Act to end those protests was warranted. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken was watching the proceedings. David, this advisor is a senior bureaucrat in Canada's defence and security establishment.
Well, that's right, Donna. Her name is Jody Thomas, and she became the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor in mid-January, 2 weeks before the convoy rolled into Canada's capital. And after the convoy had been in Ottawa for 2 weeks, on the eve of the Federal Emergencies Act being invoked, Thomas described her view of the protests in an email read into evidence at the Commission on Tuesday. This is about a national threat to national interest and institutions, she wrote, by people who do not care about or understand democracy, who are preparing to be violent, who are motivated by anti-government sentiment. That email was sent within minutes of another message Thomas sent to a senior RCMP intelligence officer asking for an assessment about the threat of these blockades, the characters involved, the weapons, the motivation. Clearly, this isn't just COVID and is a threat to democracy and rule of law. Now, Thomas herself will not testify until later this week, and she almost certainly will be asked how she came to hold these views that the convoy represented a threat to democracy. What was the evidence to support these conclusions? But as the Prime Minister's national security advisor, Jody Thomas's assessment of the blockade almost certainly would have been one of the most influential heard by the Prime Minister and his cabinet as they decided to invoke the Emergencies Act last February. Donna.
David Aiken, thanks. Remorse and regrets coming up. What Hockey Canada's former CEO had to say about the organization's so-called slush fund. Hockey Canada has spent more than $1.5 million on crisis management since its handling of alleged sexual assault cases was exposed and it was hit by bad press and lost sponsorships. The revelations came to light during the organization's fourth appearance in front of a special parliamentary committee. Today, Hockey Canada's former chief executive said he regretted not doing enough to tackle the conduct of athletes outside the rink.
I wish I could go back. I wish I could have put more policies in. My job as CEO was to really run the operations. Policies came from the board, and I'm not deflecting that back to the board. I was the CEO, and I should have been encouraging more policies.
Bob Nicholson was CEO for more than 15 years. He says he oversaw the formation and the maintenance of so-called slush funds used to pay out alleged sexual assault cases. However, Nicholson stressed he was not involved in the day-to-day operation of those funds. Girl Guides of Canada says Brownies, its organization for 7- and 8-year-old girls, will get a new name.
We've heard from these catalysts, youth, racialized folks, current and former Girl Guide members who've told us that the name Brownies causes harm. We are sorry.
Girl Guides say the change is designed to remove one of the barriers that may keep some girls or their families from wanting to join. The new name will be announced in January. Trouble tracking promises ahead. The report criticizing federal efforts to cut homelessness. Canada's record on reducing homelessness is in the spotlight tonight. The Auditor General says the federal government doesn't actually know whether its efforts are curbing the crisis. Despite the Liberals spending nearly $6 billion since 2018, the government can't say whether homelessness has increased or decreased. It's one of 4 government performance reports released today, and there's a common thread. Federal organizations are often slow to use the means at their disposal to make a difference. Eric Sorensen reports.
Every year in this country, close to 250,000 people experience homelessness. 5 years ago, the Liberal government laid out an ambitious goal to cut chronic homelessness in half by 2028. How's it going? Nobody knows, says the Auditor General. There isn't sufficient data to measure outcomes.
You need the information to be able to measure where homelessness is when you start, and then whether or not you're actually making a difference. Infrastructure Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation really have a big data gap.
We do have some data.
The federal housing minister cited tens of thousands of people who've escaped homelessness the last 3 years, but he says community groups didn't collect as much data as hoped because they were coping with just getting through the pandemic.
We need to do better in terms of the collection and the analysis, yes, and that part of that depends on the community entities, and they were facing the challenges of COVID, and we understand.
In a separate report, the Auditor General says Indigenous Services Canada has not done enough to support First Nations preparedness for emergencies like floods. This past spring, Manitoba's Peguis First Nation was inundated twice. For years, the community has called for preventive infrastructure to divert floodwaters that have destroyed homes multiple times. The AG's report says in emergencies across the country, 3.5 times more money has been spent on response and recovery than on measures to prevent and prepare for emergencies in the first place. The minister says all levels of government will have to step up.
This really is going to be an all-hands-on-deck sort of shift from reaction only in rare circumstances to the prevention and adaptation that's going to be required as we see increasing events like this every single year.
So why aren't they taking the actions needed?
The frustration, says Karen Hogan, is that many reports of the Auditor General follow previous ones that governments simply have not acted upon. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Ottawa.
Boss of the Bears. Next, how a photographer stumbled upon one of Alberta's most infamous grizzlies. If you're hiking in the Rockies, or anywhere really, it is wise to avoid bears, or at least warn them you're in their territory. And then there's the bear known as the Boss. He's a huge grizzly with a reputation and an ability to survive where others have not. And so when a photographer in Alberta had a chance encounter with the Boss twice in one day, He knew it was something special. Heather Urix-West has the story.
In and around Banff National Park, his exploits are legendary. The boss, a grizzly as big as they come.
He's also really good at occupying habitats around people without coming into conflict with people. And so that kind of just creates this scenario where he is well loved.
Over the years, the boss has made plenty of headlines. There was the time he was spotted eating a black bear, or when he survived being hit by a train. He's also believed to have fathered more than 70% of the area's cubs. But while hearing about his legend is easy in these parts, seeing the bear up close in person is another story. So when award-winning nature photographer Jason Leo Bantle spotted a set of fresh grizzly tracks in the snow, he went to investigate.
At this time of year, you don't want to go follow a grizzly bear. So I actually followed the grizzly bear backwards. I followed his trail backwards. I just had curiosity. I did a master's in biology and I love to know about animals.
After finding the bear's den, Bantle returned to his vehicle.
And I couldn't believe it, about a half a kilometer down, there was, the back of a bear with snow on it. It was glistening in the sunlight.
From the safety of his car, Bantle was able to capture these rare and up-close images of the boss.
And that evening, in the evening light as the sun set, he came through the meadow. And just this beautiful lumbering bear in his element.
The encounters made all the more meaningful because of the animal's age. The boss is believed to be over 20 years old, and grizzlies typically live 20 to 25. It's why Bantle doesn't take these stunning images for granted, or the time he got to spend in the presence of a local legend.
He's the boss, there's no question about it.
Heather Urix-West, Global News.
Wow, look at that face. That is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is the city of Cold Lake, Alberta, living up to its name. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.